Chapter 7. The king asks Esther once again what she wishes, and Esther, ever the diplomat, tells the king that she would not bother him with something petty, but her problem is pretty big. If all that was happening was her people were being sold into slavery, it would be no big issue. Just like her people don't still cry about Egypt today. Now, however, it seems they're being murdered. The king, in shock, asks who would do such a thing. After all, it's not like just days before he signed a paper saying that the Jews were to be exterminated or anything. Esther tells him in verse 6 that it is, quote, the vile Haman. Of course, the king would believe Esther over the longtime friend and advisor Haman. After all, the paper that the king gladly signed calling for the extermination of the Jews only became a bad thing once he found out Esther was Jewish. So much for equality. The king, to his credit, simply left the room for a while. During this time, according to verse 7, Haman fell to his knees to beg Esther for his life. The king, returning, saw Haman fallen before Esther and naturally assumed he was attacking her, a natural assumption when you see someone crying and sobbing and begging for mercy on their knees. Esther, of course, did not tell the king that Haman was simply begging for his life, breaking the commandment, "You shall not lie." Nor did she show him any mercy, turn the other cheek, as Christians say to do. Instead, she simply allowed the king to believe she was being attacked even though she wasn't. And at the end of this Jewish fairy tale, Haman is hanged on his own 75-foot gallows. Just like the witch is baked in her own oven and so forth. In chapter 8, Esther is given Haman's estate, and Mordecai moves in as well. In verse 7, they ask for the king to write a new decree sparing the Jews and signing with his signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. Well, one then wonders how he revoked the original paper calling for their destruction and sealed with his ring, but no matter, I suppose. We have Mordecai and Esther here gaining wealth, making the Jews a free people again, and striking so much fear into other nations that many begin to convert. Now, this is the seed of domination beginning, for up until now we have a silly little fairy tale, probably no worse than many of the Western fairy tales before they became censored and cleaned up for today's audience. Chapter 9 is where the fun really begins. The Jews immediately begin exterminating everyone. Mordecai becomes feared. Enemy nations fall. In one day, in one citadel, 500 people are murdered, including Haman's children. How forgiving, how just. The Jews here perpetrate the same evil that Haman did, yet here it is a heroic mass murder. In verse 12, Xerxes tells Esther, essentially, "Hey, you've killed hundreds, anything else?" To which Esther replies, "Obviously, yeah, I'd like to kill more." And so Haman's sons were hanged on the same gallows as him, and the Jews storm yet another nation, this time killing only 300 in verse 15. Well, they make up for it in verse 16, where they kill 75,000 people. 75,000. Not a bad day's work. And now you know the origins of the holiday called Purim. Verse 19 says it began as a day of feasting and exchanging gifts. What better way to remember the time your people murdered 75,510 people, including children? Now note again what I had said before. The God Yahweh has never been mentioned here. Religion has never been mentioned here. This book has nothing to do with religion at all. By chapter 10, Mordecai has become the top man. Just like his predecessor Joseph, Mordecai has used treachery, arrogance, and deceit to murder his enemies and essentially take care of whole nations. Verse 2 asks if the acts of Mordecai are not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. The answer? No, they're not. Mordecai is to be praised because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. This drives home the main point of all of this. Esther and Mordecai did not work for God. He didn't work for the good of God or the good of his religion or any of that. He worked for the welfare of the Jews. They did not call on God. God is never mentioned. The book is filled with fake history that there is no record of, things that are related to ancient religion and paganism that have simply been transferred into this story. Fairy tale elements, the bad guy that creates an implement of death which is then turned against him. As I mentioned earlier, you have the witch that's thrown into her own oven and so forth. The entire story just challenges you to believe that any of it is true. If this same story were not written in the Bible, if it were written in some other source, people would laugh at it. but they believe that it's true because it's in the Bible. Even beyond the obvious fairy tale nature of it, 75 or 83-foot tall gallows and constructed in a single day, and a king handing over half his kingdom to some favored harem girl, and so on and so forth. I mean, that sort of thing never historically happened. Kings didn't just hand over half of their kingdom to anyone, a queen or otherwise. But even if we took it as a fairy tale, it's hard not to be disgusted at the fact that over 75,000 people are murdered. And why are they murdered? Because the people doing the murdering were going to be murdered. It's just so self-contradictory. It's amazing that people that preach of loving your enemies and turning the other cheek and not lying and things like that could read a story where characters just blatantly lie, manipulate people, all for the end result of murdering over 75,000 people.